Hello, everyone. Thank you, Charles and Nora. That was just so incredible to kind of journey into the past so much and learn so much, really, also about all of these histories and entanglements. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today, and thank you for sort of staying with us. And also thank you, Moza, for sharing your practice with us, but also hopefully sharing B perspectives with us. Moza, I must say, is an artist, of course, and a chef and a researcher and writer, but she also happens to be a certified beekeeper. A certified beekeeper that doesn't practice beekeeping and doesn't keep bees. And of course, through that, perhaps also questioning, what does it really mean to certify knowledge? What does it really mean to certify relationships and kinship? And what does it really mean, in a way, to sort of also work with other species? I mean, this question of domestication is something that came up earlier in the conversation with Sanoj and Namrata, and it's something that kind of we will delve into as well. And Moza's work, which is the sort of center of this conversation, There is an Edible Gold, was a work that was commissioned for an exhibition, Staple, What's on Your Plate. It was an exhibition that was developed together with by Hayy Jameel, together with Delphina Foundation, and was curated by myself and Dani Burrows. And it was a show that looked at the eco-sociologies of food and the entanglements of food with society, with material, with sort of ecology. And one of the things that sort of was important for us as the work was sort of developing was to really look at also what role can art and culture sort of play, and we're hoping to sort of delve into that a little bit as well. Moza's work in the film is a three-part work, and one of them is in the exhibition, is a three-part work, and one of them is a film. And we'll start off by playing an excerpt from her film, There is an Edible Gold.
في يوم من الأيام قررت أن أشد رحالي على متن منحلة محلقة.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، حياكم الله اخواني، اهلا وسهلا. اليوم عندنا فارس العسل الغاف اللي طال انتظاره.
حملت نفسي إلى العاملات في الخلية لعلني أجدهن على متسع من الوقت والعلم والاستقرار، لإيضاح ما ظل غامضاً. لم أجد لاستقرارهن عنوان، ولكن مع ذلك لازمني الصمود، واتجهت إليهن بأسئلتي القديمة والحديثة. أصواتهن طوت صوتي الذي بات لا نبرة له. كنا منشغلات بطعام الملكة الجديدة التي وضعت في قفص، خشية من ثورة العاملات عليها قبل تمسكها بالحكم. لم يتوجوها بعد، فهي ضعيفة ورهيفة. إنها غريبة وليس لسلالتها وضوح. الواضح فقط هو اختلافها عنهن. حياتها ومصير حكمها يعتمد على مدى تقبل العاملات لها، فعليها أن تمكث في سجنها حتى تصدر الخلية قراراً جماعياً للسماح لها بتولي عرش الحكم.
The eyes are white, so he cannot see.
Wow. Oh, listen.
No, like normally he will die because first of all they don't feed themselves. They need to beg for food from the workers. And second of all, their only task in life is to mate. So since he's blind, he won't be able to fly.
هل هذه ديمقراطية؟ فتحت فمي لأسأل، لكن لم يتدحرج صوتي من لساني. ولو فعل ذلك لن تبالي العاملات بالرد عليه.
لمن يومين
إيه.
بنحطهن داخل الخليه عشان النحل يتعرف عليه. لو نزلناها الحين النحل بيقتلها على طول.
والله.
ايه بيقتلها ما يعرفها. انت دخلتي بيت ناس بيخلونك؟ ها؟
ان شاء الله يعني.
ما يخلونك بيحولك على طول. إيه.
It's always, every time you view the film, you're really kind of, I guess, in a way, transposed to a different place. But I think I want to start with this question of why bees? Why, what drew you to sort of learning from them, or what drew you to them to begin with?
It's really hard to pinpoint, I think, at a time when I started this fascination with bees. I think it was simply my obsession with, I hate to use this word, just my fascination with systems of hierarchy that exist in nature but are also part of nature, almost like resisting chaos. And I think that also took me to the kitchen, to culinary school, because it has this kind of hierarchy system as well that's directly taken from the military. And I suppose how bees work is very much likened to those systems as well, systems of violence and ruthlessness and order against nature and constant opposition. And so I think one day after I exhausted this fascination metaphorically, I just one day went to a honey festival in Jeddah and said, you know what, I'm just going to enjoy this and hear from other beekeepers, you know, and not involve my art practice at all in this until I met a beekeeper who has a mobile apiary, moves his bees across the country according to the native flora seasons. And I said, well, can I just follow you around to learn how to become a beekeeper? And I think I had this conversation with Isu, and I think I just didn't have a way to articulate it. It was because I was seeking a source of knowledge, a primary source of knowledge. I had already taken some brief bee courses, those, you know, kind of scammy one-day bee course, you know, in the UK, and I was like, well, I learned nothing, you know. Also because I couldn't contextualize it as to, well, how can I start to keep bees? And so I said, you know, I'll just shadow you and I'll collect the data with my camera just to remember. And every time I put my camera on, he started to perform. Well, you see, you know, this honey is a prized national product. And I'm like, okay, let me turn the camera off and let's just do this without, you know, every time he spoke almost, I turned the camera, switched the camera off and said, just talk to me, not to the camera, and tell me about the names of the different flora.
and how you work with the honey. And one of the first things with the bees, and one of the first things he did was he told me, well, then you have to go and see how I bring those bees. And turns out that all the bees that are used for commercial local honey production are imported. There are European species that are imported through Egypt. Had to sneak into the airport for that to take some footage. Oh, that's not so secret anymore. But I suppose, when I was doing that, I had this, creeping feeling like, this is becoming an artwork, isn't it? So I'm not just gonna learn, especially with the way that he was talking about nationalizing a product that's using or employing imported animals, or important, non-humans, who already have been through this curious journey as a European species to kind of like go through Egypt. And then I started to question, well, what about the wild bees who turned out to not be native species as well? They have migrated through centuries from South Asia, which meant many, many things. And then also the reputation of the honey that reigned supreme in the region, which is Yemeni honey, went down for various reasons. And what it meant, all this, I think, started to, this knowledge production that was happening was more than just the keeping of bees. It was a political moment in time. It was an ecological crisis waiting to happen. And there was still a ton of metaphor just that kept on being layered that I guess I was just like scooping out of all of that to see how much I can collect.
Yeah, the film does a few things quite successfully, I feel, which is to really kind of in a way meld all of these various structures that you speak about. It's simultaneously a metaphor that speaks about the bees, the colony collapse as well, and the ecological crisis, and also is really looking at a lot of these, let's say, structures that are produced by us, including the ideas of nation and how these are projected onto nature. And from that, I was wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit about how architecture also comes to sort of play a role in this. And this is something that was brought up earlier today as well.
Yes.
This idea of how things that we fashion sort of determine the life and the living of bees.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I just met a honey forager not very long ago. And I was like, wow, how do you forage for honey without ruining also, their natural ecosystem, and I was surprised to learn that he has inherited this practice. He's a man from Ras Al Khaimah. Him and his ancestors have been living on the same mountain for centuries. He's inherited the practice of honey foraging from them, and therefore have been working with the wild bees rather than employing them so much as the commercial honey producers do. And he manipulates space in the mountain, so the little coves that naturally exist in the mountain, and would kind of just have these very minimal interventions that encourage the bees to build their nests. And therefore, he's able to take the honey, but also he does it in a way where they're not completely destroyed and left without their own food, and are able to build their nests again and again and have the source of food, which in the hives that we know, the box hives, the Langstroth hives, the bees have become almost completely dependent on this form of domestication where when you take their honey, if you don't feed them, then they die, which is what sadly what a lot of the local honey producers do, because it's cheaper to let them die and import rather than maintain and keep them alive. And so even the architecture in this point, I think, or the structure, is not something that was developed to help them. Even I think in the space manipulation in the mountains, is something, these are ways of taking. And so this is why these structures are formed. And there was an instance in the work where we were negotiating, do we place objects in which the bees can create their nests and, therefore participate or collaborate in the art-making process and create these sculptural objects, let's say. But the bees didn't allow it, I think. A lot of this work has really been informed by the bees' timing, the bees', I guess, whims.
And also a practice of letting go and letting go of
Yes.
control, really, and shifting registers and listening. And also there's this diversity of knowledge that was gathered, but sometimes also there's a tension between certain histories that are inherited. We spoke about inheriting different structures as well earlier this morning. And perhaps you want to delve into those sort of learnings from the nomadic beekeeper, the nomadic beekeeping practice, of course, being something that was also inherited and not from the region, vis-a-vis, let's say, the forager and these foraging practices that are situated in particular places, and how these, in a way, also, and those architectures play in relationship to sustainable honey sort of production, extraction practices or gathering practices.
Yeah, I think I was mentioning to you that when I was listening to the sound piece by Sunuj and Namrata, the one that was listing the native flora, I now recognize a lot of them because of my interactions with the beekeeper, but he himself wasn't sure because he was still learning, and he was learning to what these flora are to extract from them. And I think this is our relationship to nature as humans anyway, so it's not to say like that's evil, totally. But there was a difference in between how I was learning about that flora for the honey and how I was learning it from the forager as well, when I was on this hike with him in the mountains, and he was pointing as we were walking to all these things, and I said, oh God, I forgot my notepad, and I can't take all these names and have to take all these pictures, and even the way that I was walking, he was like, wow, clearly you are weak, you can't, your body can't even take you up this mountain. And I said, well, I'm not from here. I'm a coastal gal. I'm trying to acclimate to the mountains. And I said, it's really, speaking about architecture, I said to him, I don't think I've ever met someone like you from that specific mountain tribe and who has this form of knowledge still. And he said to me, that wasn't common at our grandparents' generation, because his grandparents would travel down the mountain to bring the livestock and the wood to the coastal tribes. And the coastal tribes would exchange some fish and other things that would come from the trade from the coast with them. And through this exchange, and outside of the confines of the structured market, they were able to engage in this knowledge production of like who they are and their identities, and how they are let's say in collaboration as a community with one another in terms of survival even. And how when the different market structures changed, our relationship completely changed, not just with nature, but even with each other, and who holds that knowledge of nature. Just now with the comments about al-Fallahin, it's true, it's so not even secondary, it's just way down that totem pole.
Yeah, and how does one sort of not just listen or privilege, particularly when those practices are passed on, not just through oral histories, but also through really kind of a practice of life where you, in a way, engage with a particular idea of kinship or a particular space and place over kind of a longer period, for instance. One of the things that sort of came up as the work was developing and as we were in dialogue, you were really thinking about what an artist and what an artistic practice could do, particularly when delving into questions like this. And I'm curious if you want to share with all of us where this sort of led you and why we kind of, in a way, felt that it was important for the word to, in a way, expand as well.
Yeah, I suppose this is really what I was hoping for out of this talk, is kind of thinking out loud and together about what is the role of art in relaying these narratives, these stories, and especially when you're dealing with really urgent matters like ecological matters and food and just urgent themes of our lifetime. And so the workshop came about as some sort of solution to that. So part of the work was a series of workshops given by a beekeeper in Jeddah who has a sustainable honey production and also a mobile apiary, so it ties into the work. We thought, okay, there's the conceptual element of the work, which is the film, the audio piece, but there needs to be an entry point that is so accessible and just direct for people to learn about what it means to create this relationship with bees or keep bees even in the Gulf at this moment. And so the interesting thing that happened and what I was surprised of is after that series of workshops has concluded, the people who have taken a part of the workshop, demanded for an advanced series, and the next series that was organized by the learning team in Hayy Jameel was completely stipulated by the participants of the workshop, and so it had almost nothing to do with us or at this point even the work, and so I guess the thing that I was thinking about is where is that balance of the conceptual artistic expression and the access to knowledge and the learning capacities in the work, and how much does an artist really get involved to encapsulate or control what they hope people would get out of it. I could have never planned a carpentry workshop. People were making frames and hives and all of that.
I mean, it's really been actually quite a blessing to see how the community has also made, in a way, what was incepted through Moza's work, in a way, their own kind of relationship to bees. The workshops emerged as actually an initial conversation of probably having the beekeeper that she'd been sort of in a way working with and sort of traveling together with and learning from, and having a session here, perhaps, in Dubai to share his learnings and his kind of journey. But very quickly we realized that the work in Hayy was also necessary to share those particular kinds of relationships, and through that also learned the diversity of already beekeeping practices between the two Gulf nations, and between foraging as well as between sort of nomadic beekeeping practices as well, and how they've sort of shifted. The workshops emerged as initial bee perspective and beekeeping workshops, as Moza was just saying, and I must say were led by Maria Alam, who's the manager and sort of leads on learning at Hayy, and were very much driven by the local apiary and beekeeper, Dr. Saeed, who's just this incredible person that we very serendipitously just happened to meet, who was just, in a way, kind of obsessed and fascinated by bees. He started off with this journey of actually wanting to extricate the bees from his home, and then the beekeeper that came to do that and help him with that, in a way, just given his sensitivities, actually left his entire inheritance of 100 hives with the beekeeper. So suddenly, Dr. Saeed, given his sort of interests in these bees, ended up having to sort of, in a way, nurture these 100 hives. And of course, over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, they've grown to become 1,500 hives that he's now sort of, in a way, kind of responsible for and sort of caters to. And there was a lot of these questions that really came up. And of course, what does it mean for a beekeeper to work with, let's say, another species? But what does it also mean for an institution to sort of invite bees into its own place? Would it be on the path of the nomadic beekeeper? So there are a lot of these kind of conversations about. So Dr. Saeed actually visited Hayy and did a complete audit about where the bees could be situated. And it was important for us that Jeddah was on the route of the annual route that the bees would take as they would go. And that happened to be true, which then led for a certain number of hives to actually be situated at Hayy. And close to them was where the beekeeping workshops took place, which is where a lot of this sort of community was also engaging with the bees and learning from them. And then through that emerged this sort of carpentry workshop that they sort of themselves asked for. And now it's also become this sort of community that sort of thrives on WhatsApp, that's looking to, in a way, sort of, in a way, decentralize and keep bees at homes, but not in order to extract honey, but rather just for sort of biodiversity and sort of pollination sort of reasons. And another interesting development that happened through that was one of the participants, who was actually an architect, she sort of learned about the difference between the log hives and the long storm hives. And the long storm hives were built particularly for kind of access, as Moza was just saying, and these are the primary hives that we see behind us. And they're meant for access, but also to, in a way, facilitate these nomadic practices where you can actually carry 100 or 1,000 bees as you travel. But of course, in contrast to traditional hives, and then speaking also of archaeology that came up earlier today, if we look at really sort of historical beekeeping practices, quite often we would find ceramics playing a large role because they would also really, in a way, also kind of temperature control was like a huge factor. Humidity control was sort of also a huge factor. And so one of the architects that was in the workshop is now designing a hive in a way sort of really thinking about the history where the log hives would allow for a certain amount of honey to be left behind for the bees to constantly have food in order to sort of also preserve them over sort of warmer seasons. So she's in a way really sort of thinking out loud about sort of designing these. And of course, we don't yet know where that would go and if it really is in the interest of the bees. But that is, again, something that was really lovely to see kind of emerge from this work. And I think, in a way, there's a merit as well to sort of, and to you and your impulse to sort of let go and to sort of see where that might sort of lead us.
Yeah, I think in a way it was also in the awareness of what it meant to co-opt certain vocabulary. We placed some flora for the bees. First, we wanted it to be native flora from Saudi for the bees in the center, and then we ended up not being able to forage that, and so we had to rely on melliferous plants that were accessible through nurseries that are not native. And so by calling that an installation, and using the word medium to describe the workshops, we're able to infiltrate almost, the art and culture institution to host this as an artistic endeavor, and then plant the seeds for this kind of learning. And so I think I'm just a little bit curious about, how powerful these relational aesthetics are, and then where it ceases to be art, and then just us intervening in this way, I suppose this maybe is a concern for a lot of people, not just artists. How do you bring a lot of your findings and your research, whether it's scientific, academic, what have you, into a space of accessibility? I think is becoming an all-consuming thought for me at the moment in my practice.
Yeah, where do you go from here? Are you going to continue to engage with bees? I mean, in a way.
I don't know. I keep saying I'm done with them, and then they keep pulling me back. But I think, to be fair, I was talking to one of the other artists who's a part of the show, Mariam al-Naimi, and we are both engaged in the politics of food in our practice and climate change. But the way that it happened for us is kind of in reverse. So for me, it was through the politics of food that I entered into this conversation of climate change, and for her, it was the opposite way. And so I think it's more of the letting go. It's more of the leading with curiosity and the sensitivity. At the end of the day, I think even before I was working with non-human life forms, even when I was working inside the bakeries and filming the different bakers, there's always this question of what's your agency as a storyteller? What kind of platform do you give yourself? But not just a storyteller, I think a researcher, someone who's recording narratives. What is your agency? And when do you step back, and how do you create those parameters? And I think I've taken that sensitivity with the bees. I had to work with their time. I had to work with the flora seasons. I had to be stung time and time again and exercise forgiveness. And also realize my very tiny place in all of this as someone who is just hoping to plant seeds. And then, I could have never hoped for this architect to even attempt ways of thinking about a new hive, and not in a way that is, in resistance to the Western hive, but actually in a way where after retrieving all this information that's contextual, what makes sense for us then? And so this is what I hope for.
Yeah, and in a way, I think reflecting back also allow us as an institution, as individuals that work in, let's say, arts and culture, to really think about perhaps also hosting these workshops in the future. Perhaps the beekeeper also stops over every year, annually, irrespective. So the work, in a way, doesn't end with the exhibition or with that particular sort of, let's say, artwork, but rather as a seed that then allows for a kind of generative practice, in a sense.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we're hoping to nurture some of those seeds that you've sort of left with us for years to come. Yeah. With that, I'd love to sort of see if there's any questions or notes or comments from the members of audience. Yep.
Just a question, perhaps. I mean, when you were sort of investigating the beekeeping and the hives and things, did you ever come across the traditional at least that was practiced in southern Oman and also in Oman, in which they use the palm tree trunks and hollow them out and keep the bees in there, and they have them. Did you come across that?
I did, but only in a display format. And so there's a bee garden in Hatta where they display the older ways of keeping bees before they've settled on the typical hives that you see here. And so this was very important to bring back to the conversation about what does the beekeeper in Jeddah use. And so we didn't use the palm trunk hives, but we did use a log hive to kind of tie in that visually as well, to see that there's something about using an alternative, or let's say a previous mode of beekeeping. It says that the beekeeper wasn't very greedy because these hives are very difficult to clean. They can be prone to diseases, which then sends the bees into extra work to propolize the whole hive and keep it and themselves healthy. And so now it's all just I guess surrendering to the capitalistic way of thinking and working, of like what is the best way to do this, and then we give ourselves the excuse that we're helping the bees as well. We're creating less work for them so they can create more honey, but who's taking the honey at the end of the day?
Thank you.
There's another question in the front, and a second and a third.
Thank you. Thank you, Moza, for this amazing work.
fun.
One of the things that intrigued me was the use of European bees or Western bees to produce local honey. And I couldn't stop myself but think, why? Is it just because of the yield they produce more honey, or is it that there's no access to local bees? I would really like to know a little bit more about that.
So native bees cannot be domesticated. Wild bees cannot be domesticated, and that's why I say the honey forager works with them. And so your other option is to import domesticated bees. That being said, there has been a research here, I want to say for around 7 years now, to create an Emirati bee. Yeah, it sounds like a joke, but it's real. And it's by artificially, or let's say forcefully, inseminating queen bees until they create the ultimate hybrid that can withstand the climate and work extra. And so in the excerpt of the film, when you saw the beekeeper holding the queens in the cage, those were what he called Emirati bees, Emirati queens. And so the Emirati queens then will have Emirati babies. Um, I know. I think it's also that moment when I was like, wow, how did I stumble upon this? Only I would stumble upon this. And so I think there's a larger conversation here, not just about nationalizing honey and bees, but also it's in the sense of emphasizing the importance of food security and what the role of bees in pollination does for food security, and therefore they need to survive. That being said, bees in general die of exhaustion as worker bees. So they never stop working from the moment they just, become a fully formed bee in the cell. They start cleaning their cell and they keep working and die of exhaustion. And so I wonder if all this research, I really need to look more into it. I wonder if all this research is really helping anything more than this, this campaigning of, we've nationalized the bee and the honey and we're self-reliant in that way. Yes, but they're still not domesticated. They still didn't acclimate fully. And I have to say, the European bees, just like anything that you move, maybe this was a question that I had also with how botany moved, is the impact. The traveling of diseases. European bees bring with them varroa mites. If you want to imagine scale, put the palm of your hand on your chest. That's how big the mite is on their bodies, scale-wise. Whereas the wild bees that are native to South Asia clean themselves so well that they never carry varroa mites, but now are in danger of having varroa mites transferred to them because of this mobile apiary situation that's been going on with a lot of beekeepers. And so this is when I say we might be looking at some sort of ecological crisis, just like slowly, a slow train wreck, and we're just watching, waiting to see what the impact is. I believe, the same happened when, I don't know if this is true, maybe you can correct me, but I think there was a moment when they were worried about the ghaf tree, that they've brought another species of ghaf here, which totally messed up the balance of, what kind of insects are even attracted to that species of ghaf tree, and then what that does to the biodiversity of the desert.
There are a few more questions, one with Sonia at the back, and then another one at the front
Hi.
row.
Hi, Sonia.
So thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation and conversation. And certain things are racing through my mind as I listen to you. This is slightly now going away from bees itself, but thinking about how when research enters a gallery or museum space, and the processes and ways of talking about it, various ways. And I'm also very interested to know, I'm intrigued to know, are you tempted, or maybe this is half comment and half question, because, and I'm now picking 2-3 things, the Emirati bees that you mentioned, and before that, in the beginning of this presentation, you talked about how when you focused your camera on this architect friend, and you said you had this sneaky feeling that this was an artwork, when you. So I was thinking, are you tempted, or do you even want to focus on the haptic experience when the research, the presentation of it, enters a space like this, for example, or is presented as a project? Because visually this is so fascinating too, and of course haptic experience can also carry some traces of the research, but in a more oblique way. So how do you? I'm curious how different artists look at this.
I think I used to struggle with this a lot before, as what is my role? Because I'm constantly working with other people, or now it was in this instance bees as well, and seasons and flora, and this is where the institution really needs to enter, because my role can only be stretched so thin. I could not have hosted these workshops, possibly. I could not have also possibly supported myself fully through going on these excursions to collect all of this. And so, has there not been a conversation of where this is landing? Then I don't know how much of this information would have materialized to begin with. Obviously, it started as a curiosity even before, we agreed to for me to be part of the exhibition. It started before I met Rahul even. So obviously, because I'm a practicing artist and I have a full-time studio practice, I'm constantly looking at those things, and how they materialize is where I think my role needs to be negotiated with another entity that needs to create space to allow for the education, for the access to knowledge, for even the absorbing of the conceptual work as a conceptual work, even without all this research. So.
Then there was there a follow-up, or if not, then there's a second question here.
Native informants of a certain stream of knowledge, because we are transporting it to a world where it isn't originally, I mean, these are things which are outside the tight scopic regimes of visual art practice, and I'm delighted by that. But we are native informants in a way.
Thank you, Sonia.
There's a question on the first row.
Hello. Very nice to meet you. It's very interesting because I see so much of myself in this. I've been a beekeeper for 6 or 7 years.
Oh, wow.
And also chef/food scientist. It's when you were talking about the observations or the strategies to kind of maintain and develop on the beekeepers or / the bee population within the UAE. I think a lot of the issues come not just from the climate, but also from the use of pesticides and the urban planning, and when people have a colony of wild bees, they often call the pest control, and maybe that's something that can be worked on rather than having also, because if we just have a lot of beekeepers and they keep dying and we keep replacing, we're not really doing anything. But it's more of an awareness of using more sustainable ways to sustain our current flora and the plant diversity that we have, rather than just trying to, because there's still a lot of fear as well amongst households. So it's so interesting. I think that would be something that would be to go with in the next stages in this particular world.
Yeah, thank you for that. Actually, I did rely a lot on the Beekeepers Association here in the UAE. There's a Beekeepers Association who is really trying to combat these problems. So they're trying to also create awareness with the local honey producers. They do courses, which is where I got certified. Again, don't know what that means, because I'm not a practicing beekeeper, and so what does it mean? And also, they have created a calendar for when the native, or not necessarily native, but what can be grown locally, the melliferous flora that can be grown locally, when in the entire year it can grow, and they've been just hoping and praying for someone with authority to exercise this information. And so instead of seeing the plants and flowers, the beautiful flowers on the roundabouts and that beautify the roadsides, that actually they would be replaced with melliferous plants. and they're working on it, and they're a nonprofit organization, and that comes with its own struggles. And so yes, I think, again, as an artist, there's only so much that of my own role that can be stretched. But I suppose even formats like this, where I get to borrow some of your time and relay all this to you, hopefully does something. And yeah, that's that's what I hope for.
And your question also reminds me of some of these. I think one of the largest sort of legal sort of precedents in the US of a large pharma or agrochem company actually losing was a long-standing family beekeeping sort of household that sort of targeted them and in a way fought for the rights of the bees to in a way reduce the amount of kind of pesticides in that particular region in California. So I think there's definitely kind of a larger ecosystem within which we play kind of a small role, and it's always great to really kind of be reminded of how these various sort of entities, individuals, can in a way also just complement each other and perhaps work together and draw knowledge from each other. There was another question with Nehla in the front row.
Mabruk Moza. So good to see this in person finally. I have a memory of Moza, and this is really a testament to her commitment to this project. She was hosting me for a workshop last year in Ramadan. It was supposed to be a suhoor workshop. I didn't hear from her all day that day. And I get a call saying, oh, I was up all night because the beekeeper called me because the bees had arrived into Hatta. I can't remember whether it was your airport trip. Sorry, to Fujairah, and I couldn't remember if it was your airport trip or you being at the farm. But what's been really interesting about your process, and this is again something we need to consider when working with nature, is that you had to completely align with these bees and their processes and their routine, which meant if you had to be up all night during Ramadan to chase these bees, you needed to be there. My question is more about your narrative and your narration. And sometimes in order to rationalize nature, we need to humanize it as well. And there were elements, you mentioned your interest in the hierarchy. I wanted to ask if gender politics was something that came into place, and if this is a question you want to answer at all, or are you annoyed with me for even asking it? But how did you feel about that?
I mean, again, this is something informed by the bees. The workers are females. The queen obviously is a female. The male drones have such a minimal role. So there was not much interfering there, really. I suppose, fiction, I fictionalize my narratives as a way of just highlighting very explicit metaphors as well. It's being explicit without being explicit. And I don't know, I suppose this work just took a life on its own. I'd love to kind of also have a talk about what this work really is about. But at the same time, this is going back to the sense of urgency of there are things that take over and that become much more urgent to kind of pick at. And this is why I guess I don't want to discount the conceptual side of things, the poetry, the poetics, or let's say, of the work, of just encountering this visually, as well as also having all these other options, still remains something that I'm, let's say, maneuvering between. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay.
And if I can add to Moza's, just last week I was reading a paper. There's within the kind of practice or discipline of animal husbandry and domestication of sort of within entomology as well, there have been instances where gender has been sort of removed from kind of. Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
has been removed. So if you're not doing a particular work, which is supposed to be quote unquote your optimal role within a colony, then you're not called a woman, for instance. And that has been practiced within this kind of discipline of animal husbandry, particularly in relationship to sort of bees as well. And of course, there's also been now a revisiting of those histories where, and kind of a contestation of that within those disciplines as well. Any final questions? There's a question in the second row over there.
Is that me?
Yes, it's you.
Thank you so much, Moza. That was enlightening. Really impressed, and kudos. I hope you have a further many years of this project ahead as well, right?
Oh, no.
Don't say no in this not stingless project, okay? All right. This is an answer first, then a question, all right? Now the question you posed about the raf, that there's an exotic or a raf that was imported from abroad.
Yes.
It was Prosopis juliflora, which is called the Ghaifa, or the Ghaf al-Barri, right? So that's a species that was introduced in the 60s. It's a South American species. It's called the honey mesquite. Very invasive. In fact, it invades everywhere. It's invaded all over India as well right now, the western area especially. And it's a species that not many insects like. I've never seen any insects close to the tree at all. It's a distant cousin of Prosopis cineraria, or the raf tree, but it comes from a different continent, and out there it's native, but anywhere else it's exotic, all right? My question was, which bee species were you finding more? Because there's only 7 or 8 honey bees in the world that make honey, and then 2 of them which are used out here as Apis mellifera and Apis florea, the Asian dwarf honeybee, and the western honeybee.
Yes,
so which was the dominant species that you were using, or you were
Apis
finding?
mellifera, and what did they call them? The name escapes me now, but there's like a very specific name as well to them. But
Yamanetica.
No, not Yamanetica. The ones that were imported from Egypt. And it was, before getting the scientific information from the Beekeepers Association, I was asking the importers who were loading the trucks with the bees. I was like, what is their name? And they gave me, different sounding names according to what they have been accustomed to calling them as well. And for a very long time, I relied on that name that now escapes me as well. Yamanetica, I think, is the one that
we worked with in Saudi.
Yeah, we were working with in Saudi. They're smaller. These ones are much bigger. Yeah. And again, just so much of them are brought that probably is the bee you're encountering if you see bees around, in urban spaces.
Possibly, yes. Thank you.
Was there a last question? I thought I saw a hand raise at the back.
I don't think
If
so.
not, we'll conclude the session for now. Thank you all so much for staying with us. Thank you, Moza.
Thank you, Rahul.
I just want to say thank you. Thank everybody for joining us today, and especially our speakers for such a wonderful afternoon. Please do join us tomorrow. We'll be starting at 2 p.m. onwards. And yes, thank you again, everyone.